Gary Cooper, the legendary Hollywood actor known for his stoic charm and commanding presence on screen, left behind more than just a legacy of classic films. Decades after his passing, a note he secretly wrote has surfaced, revealing confessions that are shocking, deeply personal, and utterly transformative to how we understand the man behind the iconic roles. For years, Cooper's life was shrouded in the mystique of Hollywood glamour. He was admired for his talent, respected for his professionalism, and adored for his reserved yet magnetic personality. Yet behind closed doors, the story was far more complex than anyone realized. The note he left, hidden from the public eye, unveils truths about his personal struggles, regrets, and the relationships that shaped him. Confessions that could rewrite the narrative of his life and career. What did Cooper really feel about fame, love, and the decisions that defined him? What secrets did he carry silently, only to immortalize them in a note that would surface decades later? This revelation promises to challenge long-held perceptions, offering a rare and intimate glimpse into the private mind of a Hollywood icon. Gary Cooper's note is not just a document. It's a window into a human story of vulnerability, honesty, and profound reflection, forever changing the way we view one of cinema's most legendary figures. For decades, Gary Cooper's name stood as a symbol of classic Hollywood, elegant, dignified, and quietly powerful. He was the actor who didn't need theatrics or wild gestures. His presence alone commanded the screen. Fans saw him as the embodiment of strength and steadiness. The man who always did the right thing, whether in High Noon, Sergeant York, or the countless westerns that made him an American legend. But the truth, as his family would later learn, was far more complicated. When Cooper passed away in 1961, the world mourned a hero. His funeral was solemn, attended by the biggest names in Hollywood. Yet no one suspected that he had left something behind, something deeply personal, something he never shared publicly even with those closest to him. It would not be discovered until many years later. Tucked away in a private drawer in his Montana home, a handwritten note sealed in a small envelope, with his initials pressed lightly into the paper. The discovery was made by someone who had no idea what they were about to uncover, a family archivist sorting through decades of memorabilia. Inside the envelope was a single folded sheet, yellowed slightly by time but still perfectly legible. The first line alone was enough to bring a hush over the room. "There are things I never said out loud, but they must be known." For those who loved Cooper, this moment was world-tilting. He had always been a man of restraint, measured words, measured emotions, measured actions. The note promised something he had never given freely: unfiltered truth. As the family gathered, the room filled with equal parts dread and curiosity. They knew Cooper carried burdens, as all people do. But what could have weighed so heavily on him that he preserved it in writing rather than speak it aloud? The envelope had been hidden carefully, intentionally. This was not an accident of storage, it was a confession meant to be found only when he could no longer be questioned about it. The first paragraph spoke of his struggles with fame. Cooper revealed the depths of his discomfort with the Hollywood lifestyle, the expectation to always be composed, flawless, and heroic. "I wore the mask well," he wrote, "but sometimes I forgot what the real man underneath looked like." He admitted that while the world embraced his calm, quiet demeanor, it wasn't always natural. Much of it was performance. A shield against a world he found overwhelming, Cooper wrote about the fear that haunted him throughout his career. The fear of disappointing the people who saw him as something more than human. He confessed that he often felt trapped by the characters he played. Heroes never faltered, never broke down, never admitted weakness. But Cooper was human, and he carried regrets, mistakes he made, relationships he mishandled, words he should have said and never did. Then the note took a more intimate turn. He spoke of love that lifted him, love that complicated his life, love that left scars he never allowed others to see. He confessed that he had hurt people unintentionally, that his silence often felt safer than honesty, and that this habit had cost him relationships he treasured deeply. For his family, these passages were heartbreaking. They had known him as gentle, protective, and soft-spoken. To discover the depth of his private turmoil forced them to see him not just as a father or husband, but as a man wrestling with insecurities and regrets he never voiced. By the time they reached the last lines of the note, no one in the room remained untouched. Cooper ended with a simple, haunting sentence. If this is ever found, let it serve as a reminder that even the strongest men are still men. The revelation changed everything. The legend they admired remained, but alongside it now lived a fuller, more human portrait, one shaped by vulnerability, truth, and the confession he never dared speak aloud. The room felt impossibly still as Gary Cooper stared at the blank page before him, a fragile square of white that suddenly carried the weight of an entire lifetime. Outside, the late afternoon sun dragged long shadows across the floorboards, turning the edges of the room gold as if time itself were urging him to speak before it was too late. He had lived most of his years with a quiet dignity, choosing silence over spectacle, restraint over confession. But now, as his hands trembled and his breath shortened, the truth he had held back for decades finally demanded a voice. He had always believed that honesty could ruin more lives than it healed. Hollywood adored him as the man who stood tall, who faced danger without flinching, who carried entire worlds on his shoulders. But in private, the weight he bore was far more devastating: regrets he never allowed anyone to see, love he never knew how to protect, guilt that had followed him like a persistent shadow. For years he had convinced himself that silence was mercy. Yet as he reached for his pen, he felt an ache so sharp it nearly pulled him to his knees. He realized with heartbreaking clarity that silence had only been an escape from courage. Gary drew a shaky breath and began writing the first line. His mind drifted back to the faces that had shaped him, haunted him, saved him. There were friendships left broken, promises made in moments of fear, love withheld out of pride or confusion. And above all, there was the one truth he had never dared reveal, the truth that had kept him awake countless nights, that had carved deep hollows beneath his eyes. He paused when the memory surfaced, raw and uninvited, pulling him backward into years he thought he had buried. He had been a young man, then fierce, ambitious, terrified of vulnerability. His stardom was rising faster than he could comprehend, and everyone around him expected perfection. But perfection was the thing he feared most, because it left no room for the parts of him that were flawed, frightened, human. In that swirling chaos, he had found a connection he never expected. Something tender and real in a world overflowing with illusions. Yet he let it slip away, convinced he wasn't worthy of it. Convinced that admitting how deeply he cared would shatter the image he was desperately trying to protect. Now, as he wrote, the truth spilled onto the page like a confession pulled straight from the deepest chamber of his heart. He wrote about the mistakes he could never reverse, about the nights he wished he could relive, about the apologies that sat heavy on his tongue but never found their way out. And woven between his lines was a kind of grief that no audience had ever witnessed, a grief for the life he lived, and the one he never allowed himself to have. His breathing grew labored, but he continued, determined. There were moments he stopped, staring at the page with a pain so profound it threatened to silence him again. But each time he forced himself to keep moving. This was the last thing he would leave behind, the only thing that would tell the world who he truly was beneath the steel-eyed hero everyone worshipped. The sun dipped lower, softening into dusk. He felt his strength ebb, like a tide pulling out for the final time. He read the words he had written, every sentence a piece of his soul laid bare. For the first time in years, he felt something close to peace. Not happiness because some wounds cut too deep for that, but a quiet acceptance that at least his truth, long hidden, would no longer die with him. He folded the note carefully, hands trembling but deliberate, and placed it where he knew it would be found. His chest rose in one last deep breath, the kind that feels like a surrender and a release at the same time. He looked around the room, not at the trophies, not at the photographs of premieres and triumphs, but at the small, ordinary things that had been his real life. The pen, the wooden table, the fading light, and then, with a heaviness that felt strangely like relief, he closed his eyes. The world outside continued turning, unaware that something irrevocable had shifted in the silence. But in that room, in that folded note waiting to be discovered, everything Gary Cooper had never said was finally ready to speak. The note lay on the small oak table like a sleeping truth, untouched and unaware of the storm it would soon unleash. When it was finally discovered, the quiet in the room shattered instantly, not with chaos, but with the kind of stunned, breathless disbelief that makes the air feel heavier. The man who found it had known Gary Cooper for decades. He had seen the hero, the legend, the icon. But he had never seen the man who... His hands trembled as he unfolded the paper. The first lines were simple, but they carried the unmistakable weight of a soul unburdening itself. As he continued reading, his brows tightened, his throat clenched, and the realization struck him with the force of something sacred and devastating. Gary had lived with a sorrow no one had ever noticed. The world had loved him. Yes, but it had never truly known him. The words revealed a truth, so deeply hidden that even those closest to him had sensed only shadows of it. He wrote about the pressure of being the man everyone expected him to be: stoic, brave, untouchable. But beneath that armor was someone terrified of disappointing the people he cared about. Someone who'd spent years pretending the applause could drown out the loneliness. And then came the part that changed everything. A confession that rewrote the past, rearranged memories, and cast his life in a painfully different light. He wrote of a love that had shaped him. A person who had once made him believe he could step out from behind his carefully crafted mask. A love he lost not because it faded, but because he was too afraid to choose it. He didn't name the person, but the description was unmistakable: gentle eyes, quiet strength, a laugh that seemed to lift the weight off his chest. It was someone he had walked away from, someone he watched marry another, someone he never stopped missing, even as the world celebrated him. The man reading the note lowered it for a moment, breath shaking. He had been there during that time. He remembered the change in Gary, the silent days on set, the restless nights in between filming, the way he suddenly threw himself into roles with ferocity that bordered on desperation. They all chalked it up to fame, pressure, exhaustion. But now, seeing the truth on the page, it felt like watching a wound reopen across the decades. He continued reading. Gary wrote about guilt, sharp, lingering guilt for letting ambition overshadow the people who had cared for him most. He apologized to friends he had drifted from, to family he had disappointed, to the woman he married yet often kept at an emotional distance because he didn't know how to offer all of himself. It wasn't a condemnation of his life, nor was it a plea for sympathy. It was simply honesty, raw, unvarnished honesty from a man who had spent his entire adult life hiding in plain sight. Then came the sentence that caught the reader completely off guard. A line so startling, so revealing, that he had to read it twice to fully absorb its meaning. "I lived as a hero on screen," Gary had written, "but I never had the courage to be honest off it. That is the regret I take with me." The man pressed the paper to his lips, eyes stinging. The world had celebrated Gary Cooper as the embodiment of courage, the man who stared danger in the face and never blinked. But in the privacy of his final confession, Gary admitted that bravery had been his greatest illusion. He had saved countless characters, whole towns, even nations on screen. But he had never fully saved himself. He folded the note again, much more carefully this time, as though it were made of something fragile and irreplaceable. When he stepped out of the room, the weight of what he carried felt almost unbearable. He knew that once the contents of the note were revealed, everything the world believed about Gary Cooper would shift, not in a way that tarnished him, but in a way that finally made him whole. And as he walked down the quiet hallway, he realized something profound. For decades, Gary Cooper had belonged to the public. But these words, this truth, belonged to the few who truly cared, those who would read his confession not as a scandal, but as the final, aching testament of a man who had spent his life trying, in his own flawed and human way, to be good. The news spread quietly at first, whispered from one trusted friend to another, until it reached the small circle of people who had truly loved Gary Cooper, not the Hollywood icon, not the heroic silhouette on the silver screen, but the gentle, complicated man beneath it all. When they gathered to hear the contents of his note, the room felt charged with an almost reverent stillness, as though everyone sensed they were about to witness the unveiling of a truth Gary had carried alone for far too long. As the note was read aloud, a hush fell over the group. Every line cut through the air like a confession spoken straight from the grave, yet there was no bitterness in his words. Instead, there was a heartbreaking tenderness, an awareness of his own flaws, a sorrow for the people he had unintentionally hurt, and a longing for the life he might have lived if fear hadn't governed so many of his choices. One woman, a lifelong friend who had known Gary before the fame and the spotlight, pressed a trembling hand to her mouth as the confession of lost love echoed through the room. She remembered the person he described. Everyone did. They remembered the warmth Gary had radiated during that brief, luminous period of his life. The way his eyes softened whenever the person entered the room, the way his voice changed gentler, more hopeful. They also remembered the day it ended, quietly, with no explanation, only a subtle dimming of the light in his face. Listening to his written confession now, decades later, they finally understood. Gary hadn't chosen fame over love. He had chosen safety over vulnerability, control over risk. It was a decision he regretted every single day afterward. Even as the world praised him for roles he couldn't stop feeling detached from. A man who had worked closely with Gary on several films leaned back in his chair, eyes glistening. He carried all that alone. He whispered, his voice barely audible. He wasn't asking anyone in the room. He was asking the memory of the man he had admired, the friend he had never fully understood. The note continued, revealing regret after regret, small ones, large ones, and the ones that cut deepest of all, the unspoken apologies Gary never found the courage to voice while he lived. He apologized to his daughter for the times he was distant, to his wife for the moments he shut her out, not because he didn't love her, but because he didn't know how to deal with his own inner fractures. He admitted he tried to be a good man even when he didn't believe he was one. Then came the final paragraph, and it felt like a sudden drop into silence. His handwriting in this section was smaller, shakier, as though emotion had made his hand tremble. I want those who cared about me to know I never meant to live behind a veil. I admired you all more than I ever said. If I seemed distant, it was because I was afraid you'd see the flaws I couldn't accept in myself. The world saw me as strong, but true strength, I learned too late, is telling the truth to the people you love. A quiet sob broke the stillness. No one turned toward the sound. They were all fighting their own emotions, each person remembering moments when Gary had seemed present yet far away. Open yet unreachable. What struck everyone most was not the confession itself, but the humanity of it. Gary Cooper had always been painted as a near-mythic figure, tall, stoic, impossibly composed. But here, in his own words, he revealed the fragile truth. He had been searching for peace his entire life, one by one. The people in the room began sharing their memories, not the glamorous stories, but the quiet ones, the time Gary helped a crew member in distress without expecting recognition. The time he sat for hours comforting a friend after a loss. The way he always remembered small details about people, even those he didn't see often. It became clear that his regrets did not define the entirety of who he was. They simply made him human. When the note was finally folded and placed back on the table, the room felt different, not heavier, but softer. As though the weight Gary had carried had been gently lifted and shared among those who mattered most. For the first time, they saw him not as the legend the world worshipped, but as the man he had always been beneath the spotlight, flawed, longing, compassionate, frightened, and full of love he never fully allowed himself to express.